Let's be brutally honest right now. That's a big question.
I'm looking for someone who doesn't want to go to base camp, but they want to go to the very top.
Whether it's here, India, New York.
Civilization was born at happy hour.
That's what wins. That's what stands out. That's what people are interested in. That's what I want to know. The Hospopreneurs Podcast with James Henderson. Hello and welcome to episode 92 of the Hospopreneurs Podcast. Dr. Darren Hughes met with 120 different investors during the first investment round for his AgTech company, Laconik. Since then, the total raise has pushed through 1 million Australian dollars and has the support of both venture capitalists and government with names like Wavemaker Partners and the Grains Research and Development Corporation, the GRDC. Prior to Laconik, Darren held both technical and management roles over a 20-year career as an agronomist, most recently as the managing director of the GRDC. Here he oversaw a portfolio of 150 projects with an annual investment of $12 million, conducting research in agronomy, soils, farming systems, and crop nutrition. He shares a tough story about his first industry job in the US, comes from a fourth-generation family farm, and aims to explore ways to feed the world through science. Hello and welcome to the show, Darren.
Welcome. Thanks, James.
Anytime. It's a pleasure to have you on today, and I'm looking forward to getting into the interview. It's an interesting angle that we've not really covered on the program before, so I'm excited to open some conversation around wheat as well. I understand that's a background of yours, and I know that there are going to be some incredible insights that come out over the episode. So first question, as you know, that I like to ask is a crazy hospitality story or exceptional hospitality experience. So what does that mean to you? Do you have a story? Do you have an experience from your career?
So I finished university in 2001 and I actually never took a gap year when I finished school. So as soon as university finished, I went off to the US. And the thing that I always wanted to do was to go and drive a harvester, which harvests wheat. So I worked for a company based in Minnesota and we harvested wheat all the way from northern Texas right up to the Canadian border. So as I like to say, I saw the US by seat of harvester. What was really interesting, though, is that the boss was an ex-Vietnam vet and he used to run his harvest crew like a platoon. We were a group of 12 international guys who were no older than 25. We had very little experience in what we were doing. If you ever lost your sense of humour, there's no way you would survive. And the way the boss used to, talk about it is he loved employing international people because they couldn't take off in the middle of the night. If you were an American, he'd find American employees who would just up and leave. It was a very tough gig, but we certainly learnt a lot about ourselves and we learnt how to work, which as a 21-year-old guy straight out of university was pretty key. And we had a lot of fun out of it. I've got a lot of lifelong friends as a result of that experience.
Fantastic. Being ex-military, was he particularly hard on you guys? Is that why people upped and left? Obviously, the work was difficult. What was it that made it so hard?
He was very hard on people and he had very high expectations. One of Rob Holland's claims to fame is that everything had to be square with the world. So every time you parked up a machine at night, it all had to be in a row. Whenever you parked any of his cars or his trucks, it had to be well presented. Whenever you had time off, everything had to be, spick and polish and clean. There was no getting away with anything. And I guess Rob's method of communication was to shout. There was no other ways from getting around that. But one thing Rob did do, though, was when he understood who you were and he learned a little bit about, his employees, he became highly respectful. And once you earn Rob's trust, he was a very interesting man and very taught you a lot about yourself. And that's where I cut my teeth and learn as a young man, how to grow up and develop a work ethic.
It sounds like Rob had an impact on you in your early career there. Have those philosophies then flourished in you as you've developed your career?
Absolutely. One thing that I learnt with Rob is the passion of resilience and the need to have resilience. And as a startup entrepreneur, that's exactly one of the things that you need to have. Irrespective of how hard it gets, you knuckle down and you get the job done. And that is something that Rob taught me as a really young man, is to just keep going, you'll get there in the end. And that has proved essential later on in my life.
I want to take another angle on that to press it a bit further, because I've even spoken about resilience on the show. But I'd like to ask you your perspective on when it is is time to give up on something too?
Really good question, and we can explore a little bit later in the interview, but to getting Laconik to where it is, I had to approach 130 investors. There were some pretty dark times here about 12 months ago on Laconik as we were going through the process of raising our seed round capital. The thing that kept me going the whole time, though, was that we continued to get green shoots from our customers, right? There was something there. We needed to keep going. There was also the continued, understanding that we had that the problem is real. Growers and agronomists are confused when it comes to fertiliser decisions, and there's a real opportunity there. And I guess it's always a passion that this is something that I wanted to do. I wanted the opportunity to go out there and really have a go in my life. I'm very clear on what I'm doing, and I guess it was just really a matter of rolling up the sleeves and getting on with the job. I just finished the book Grit by Angela Duckworth, and I'd highly recommend that to anyone who's considering the entrepreneurial journey. It's an essential sort of read, and those philosophies and skills that she talks about in the book is merely what I applied to the early stages of Laconik, which has allowed us to have the early stage success that we've been able to have.
It's a book I've heard of myself but not read, so it sounds like there's another indicator as to me to read that book too. Thank you for sharing it, Darren. I want to take the conversation in a different direction to open it up more broadly into why you do, what it is that really inspires you to do what it is that you do now.
So I guess my overlying philosophy, my why, is ultimately to explore ways to feed the world through science. There's a lot of rhetoric that goes on, but ultimately the world population is increasing. We're going to need more food to, ultimately feed those people. My background is in science, PhD in wheat agronomy, and I believe the only way that we're going to be able to feed the world is to invest in really good science. So that's ultimately my why. That's why I get out of bed. I largely self-funded my PhD. I never had a grant to start with. I never had a scholarship. When I originally undertook it, I was prepared to put my own money into it because I believed that science needed to, develop new ideas. And I guess that's led me to develop where we're at today.
Fantastic. Do you see wheat specifically in that future? That's your background, your formal education. Do you see wheat specifically having a core role in the future of food?
I do. I kind of look at wheat as almost a bit like baseload power. Wheat is a bit like baseload food production. There are trends that will come and go in the food world, but I always see wheat coming back to, the staple of most diets. Bread is a pretty important component of most of our lives, and all the other products that we make with wheat. It's going to be a pretty essential food moving into the future.
What makes wheat so core to our diets and what we do? Is it actually that it is the most nutritious to have and be a staple in diet, or is it because from an evolutionary perspective we've developed from that agricultural farming base of wheat?
I suspect it's the secondaries. It's kind of almost an ancestral thing that we've grown up with. There's been billions and billions of dollars in investment into wheat to have the current varieties that farmers are growing now. I think it's just going to be around for a long time. There is a bread type food in most cultures, whether that's a flat bread or a noodle or a loaf of bread that we associate in Australia. Most cultures have a bread type product which requires a wheat as a base, and I can't see that changing into the future. More so, we're starting to see a bit more of the plant-based protein and plant-based food diets moving forward. I think wheat is going to play an important role in that. That may not be in the bread component. It may be the other functional characteristics that wheat has, such as the gluten and the protein that's in the wheat that becomes, a holding agent for foods as we grow.
Fantastic. Darren, I'd like to know how you define what you do.
So I like to say that we're in the fertiliser business. So why we don't sell fertiliser, we sell where and how much fertiliser to apply. Ultimately, the recommendation, which then goes and drives fertiliser sales. So Uber is a taxi company that doesn't own any taxis. Airbnb is an accommodation hotel provider that doesn't own any hotels. Laconik is a fertiliser supplier that doesn't actually sell fertiliser.
Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit more for listeners? Like, most people are familiar with those companies, but how that's been applied to those models. Obviously, you've taken them as models, being in a startup world, making reference to them too. How have those philosophies of those businesses affected you, and how does that all tie together?
So I guess the first step in deciding how much fertiliser to purchase is to work out how much fertiliser does the crop need. So the farmer and the agronomist work together to ask the question, how much do I need to apply? And within that decision-making framework, they use a lot of complex soil types and decision-making model to enable that to happen. Once they work out how much they want to apply, they then go and order the amount of fertiliser that they need. Using the analogy to something like Uber, the first step is to actually decide where you want to go, and then you go and order that car. Then the car comes along after that. So that's how I sort of create the analogy between what we're doing here at Laconik and I guess other well-known business models that are out there.
What about maybe that underlying principle that you peel back those businesses to look at them in terms of other things that they offer instead of ride sharing or accommodation? I've heard something similar with Uber, Airbnb, to be selling convenience, to be selling time instead. So I'm interested to know what you and why you peel back Laconik to be something around advice rather than the product itself.
We look at where fertiliser decisions are at and how little it has evolved really over the 50 years that farming has really started to adopt the use of artificial fertilisers. And it's changed little in that time. I look at what's happening globally and the amount of disruption that's happening, and I think the fertiliser industry is primed for massive disruption and the adoption of new technology to allow that disruption to happen. If you can disrupt how fertiliser decisions are made, I believe there's an opportunity to disrupt how the global fertiliser industry works. If you can make a better recommendation for where and how much fertiliser a farmer needs to apply, it will ultimately affect the sales of fertilisers moving forward.
What is making that market prime for disruption right now?
I believe it's the lack of innovation that's gone on. So, for example, in 1963, a researcher by the name of Colwell first published the soil test that works out the phosphorus content when we measure phosphorus in the soil. Since 1963, I think we've had about 7 different soil tests developed to measure the amount of phosphorus in the soil. So while we think there may have been some innovation, I view that as all we've gone is built a better mousetrap. We've just built a better soil test. And there's still inherent problems with the soil test that we've got out there today. And no one is really thinking outside of the box in terms of trying to understand less and less about how to make a fertiliser decision. We've kind of sort of taken a step back and gone, let's look at modern computing power. Let's look at the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning. Let's look at this opportunity that this world of data is now creating. And can we ultimately use that to make a better fertiliser decision to improve farmers' profitability?
How does that then become something that you execute?
It's a really interesting question. So I guess our ultimate path to market is not to the end user, the farmer. We ultimately want to go through large agribusiness. So in the fertiliser sales game, largely dominated, certainly in Australia, by 4 or 5 major companies. We have the low-cost provider who effectively just sells fertiliser as a bulk commodity. You could use the analogy that they're the Tiger Airways. At the other end of the spectrum, we have the full-service type provider of fertiliser. So these companies have area managers, they have experts in fertiliser, they invest heavily in research and development. I like to call them more the quintessence, right? They're the full-service type. They do that in order to differentiate what is ultimately just a bulk commodity. Urea, which is the main nitrogen fertiliser used globally, is urea. It's 46% nitrogen. Ultimately, people want to buy it for the least cost they can, but the way the bigger companies operate is to differentiate on service. When we look at the service provisions that have been developed over the last really 15 years in this space, each fertiliser company has just tried to do a little bit more than the other. There's a tick for tat. One has sort of developed a soil test, the other one's developed a soil test. One's invested in an app to track where your soil testing is going, the other one invests in an app. How do they go about fundamentally changing that service provision? That is one thing that we see there's an opportunity. And the other area is this growing movement within investors and globally within society for the environmental, social and governance components on companies. Fertiliser is a pretty big, polluter in the environment, and we only have to look what's happening up in the Great Barrier Reef and the application of primarily nitrogen on the sugarcane up there. And what are the environmental regulations that may potentially come on to these big fertiliser companies down the track? And do they need to start to demonstrate their environmental credentials in the eye of the average investor and just the average public now? Is that going to become a social licence to operate into the future? We're certainly starting to see our big customers are looking to us to provide answers of how are they better using their fertiliser, and does our solution allow them to report through to their board they are being more effective in the way they apply fertiliser, being more environmentally friendly. So I think that's the way some of these big fertiliser companies are going to go as this sort of green movement happens into the future.
There were so many points that you brought up in there. The thing that I would like to touch on in what you just brought up is around the tit for tat, and you and your partner, Wayne, have taken action faster than another research project. Could you please elaborate a little bit more on that?
In a previous role, Wayne has developed or been involved in the development of a lot of the, underlying models that drive fertiliser decisions used by agronomists and the big companies at the moment. The long and short of it is that the project that Wayne and I scoped up, industry's gone away and contracted that. It's a 5-year, $15 million project. And Wayne and I have inherently got a lot of knowledge where the technical gaps are and deep understanding of the problem that now exists in farmers. So we've decided to go and radically do something different to see if we can do some innovation outside of the box. The research project that we worked on was ultimately just going to deliver incremental gain. It'll deliver productivity gains of 1 to 1.5% for farmers. I'm not necessarily convinced it'll deliver fundamental change or transformational change. And that's what sort of Wayne and I were working on, are currently working on. It involves high risk. It may come to nothing. We'll know in 5 years whether it worked. But the opportunity and the timing is perfect now to go and explore that.
So you mentioned there that you believe that your project is going to, or your company is going to create that fundamental change that you believe is required in the fertilizer industry. What is it that really is a fundamental change that is taking place there through your technology?
I guess in the past, what we're able to do with the machine learning and the adoption of new technology is that we're able to collect and analyse data at a scale that was never before possible. So, for example, for the traditional fertiliser trial to be done, it was costing in the order of $15,000. We can do a very similar trial, still collect statistically valid results, but do it over a much greater environment. And our cost per trial is in the order of tens of dollars.
Wow.
So we have an ability to rapidly collect on the performance of how plants respond to fertiliser across massive environments on a scale that was never before possible. That's how we believe we can disrupt this.
In doing that, you're obviously having dialogue that people haven't had before. I get the impression that they haven't been talking about these things. Well, I guess there is a large project because some people have been talking about it. So are people talking about the sorts of change that you're discussing with them, or is it a brand new concept?
No, the inherent problem of making fertiliser decisions is there. People are starting to see the potential of a data-driven solution. And when I go and talk to the R&D managers that work for the big companies that are now our customers, they can certainly see the potential for the technology that we're developing, and they believe it's got a fit. Maybe the future, we'll know in 5 or 7 years once we've got enough data to actually make it become mainstream. But people are starting to think about the potential of it, and I guess that's what attracts them to us, is that we've got some outside of the box thinking and they can see the potential for what we're doing.
I'd like to bring up a point you made a little bit earlier around going to 130 different investors, because the process of collecting that data is obviously costly as well. So you guys have raised capital for it. So can you talk us through the process in doing that and some of the challenges that you encountered? You know, it sounded like a very stressful experience for you, and it is for many, many people going through a capital raising process. And we've had previous guests speak about that same sort of experience. So could you share your experiences with that process?
Incredibly challenging, but also incredibly rewarding when you sign the final document and the money transfers into your bank. If I take a step back in that, July 2018, Wayne and I sat down in a cafe somewhere and had a coffee and really thought about what it is that we want in Laconik. And we were prepared to take on massive risk to bring about fundamental change. And it ultimately come down to the fact that in order to do that, we needed to attract investment into the company to capture the opportunity that we see. I guess it was is my role in that ultimately trying to attract those investment dollars? While it took us 130 attempts, I'm absolutely convinced that the first 100 times I didn't know how to communicate. And that's simply the case, is I'd never approached investors before. I didn't know what they were looking for. I didn't know what their pressure points were. And it wasn't until, I guess, a few of the mentors sat me down, pulled me into the boardroom in the, the accelerator that we're involved in, and really pointed out the flaws in what I was communicating. It wasn't until we sort of got to the 129th that we had a bit of interest, and in January this year, we ended up signing our term sheet and closing the deal last month. I guess when I look back at what we did, it was really hard to get that lead investor. It really made me think hard about the company, though. It really made me learn how to communicate what we're doing. In the past, I'd spent a lot of time speaking with farmers and agronomists. Now my role is to communicate what Laconik does in the broader sense to the community. So I know how to talk about fertiliser more. But in doing that, we've also probably turned down more investment than we've actually accepted in the end. So we've been lucky enough to be in that role. And we turned that investment down for a number of reasons, but it was a challenge. The book by Carol Dweck on mindset, that ability to develop a growth mindset and the ability that you can ultimately learn anything, was also fundamental in my early stages of raising the capital. And now we've got to a stage where we wanted to be.
So now that you are there, what is it that you're looking to? What is it that you're learning? What is it that you're exploring that you believe is going to help you take the next step forward?
Really good question, because 5:30 tomorrow morning, I jump on a plane and go to the US for 2 weeks. So my role now becomes, as the CEO, is to ultimately think more strategically in what are the global opportunities for our technology. That's what I'll be doing for the next couple of weeks. Once we come back from that, we've really got to start to focus on the operations of the business. We need to try and get some really big customers across the line. We need to finalise our software so customers can log on and access the technology simply and easily. And we need to communicate the benefits of our technology. We've got a student working for us at the moment, and they're working through analysing probably about 50 replicated trials that we've done this year to work out whether the technology is actually making a benefit. And we'll have that hard number to prove that it's actually working by the end of January. Going into the end of January, we'll be then starting to look at how do we participate in another capital raise, Series A, sort of middle of next year.
So are there obviously some more technical steps that you're going to be undertaking? What about how you plan for your resources in executing those steps?
I spend a lot of time awake at night just thinking and chatting with my co-founder and Laconik's CTO in that. And then we kind of make a decision with the budget constraints that we've got and execute. We don't have any complex decision-making background. It was just me coming up with random thoughts and getting the approval of my two key people in Laconik, and we just act on it.
Darren, I'd like to ask, what innovations beyond what you guys are executing are happening in the agricultural industry more broadly?
I think we're really seeing some interesting stuff happen in the robotics space. Personally, I believe that it's got a long way to go, but that automation is going to become really important. I believe there's a lot of opportunity in the use of statistics. I like to see more use of statistics, and in that sense, I look at most plant breeding now is being done by largely statisticians. I think our agronomy decisions, our farming system decisions can be made better by using statistics and the application of data in that whole concept. I like the speed with which some of our new varieties are starting to be developed, so reducing that time frame that it takes to get a new variety to market. It was traditionally taking 7 to 10 years. It's now taking anywhere between sort of 4 to 5 years to bring new varieties to market. So the genetic potential, the genetic gains in the wheat varieties that farmers are growing are becoming quicker. And I guess what is the application of satellite technology moving forward? We're still in the early stages of that. Satellites are providing a lot of information, and we've got a long way to link that generation of information to making the profitable management decision for the farmer. Presenting more information to the farmer is not going to cut it anymore. They've got so much information as it is. We need to take that next step and make the profitable management decision for the farmer. They're some of the key interesting trends that I'm seeing in this AgTech space.
What impact does the advancement of technology in this space have for the end consumer, for us on the table?
Really good question. Ultimately, I think most of it is going to be targeted towards the farmer. It's the profitability for the farmer. I guess, and you'd put it at an absolute macro scale, is that The technology will be leading to better fertiliser decisions, so reducing the impact of environmental outcomes of using fertiliser on the environment. That's the ultimate aim for consumers in this instance.
Does it change obviously using different fertiliser or the chemical makeup of the fertiliser or the soil does in some way impact the food that's grown in that region? What sort of impact is that having? Are there health benefits or costs even associated?
There could well be health benefits, or I guess better quality product being produced. One of the challenges that are existing out of the WA wheat environment at the moment is a low protein wheat. Protein in wheat is the primary quality characteristics. So we all walk into a shop and we all see nice, consistent loaves of bread that are being produced. It's protein that primarily drives that. The underlying driver of protein is nitrogen, and because we're developing new technology to better predict a plant's requirement for nitrogen, we have the potential to link that through to better protein outcomes as well, so better quality. We're still analysing the results of our trials this year, but the early stage work that I've seen is that we're getting an increase in the protein content of the wheat.
Fantastic. Is there a quality of the protein in the quantity as well?
There is a quality of the protein, and I guess in the old ancient soils of WA, that changes as well. You can affect the gliadin and glutenin, which are the two major proteins in wheat, by simply changing the amount of fertiliser that we apply. It's a much more complex area, and certainly an area that we haven't looked into for the potential of our technology. But I did my PhD in this area, and you can improve the functionality of the protein by changing the rate of fertiliser.
Is that the rate of content of fertiliser, or you said the rate of content of fertiliser, or is it an amount of content, or what are we looking at? I'm not clued up in this particular area, so I'd love to hear an overview for the layman like myself on this front.
So primarily, the more nitrogen fertiliser we apply, the higher grain protein we get in our wheat. The higher grain protein leads to a better quality loaf of bread.
Easy. Thank you very much for that one, Darren. I'd like to ask just a few more questions. The next one is what your biggest challenge is right now.
My biggest challenge is ultimately getting product market fit. So we've got 4 or 5 developers out in Nepal working on the software. We have to get that out to our customers as quick as we can to provide them an opportunity to review the technology and provide feedback to ensure that it's solving a problem and it's, usable in their eyes. One of the other macro problems or challenges that I see is that Australia has been in 2 years of drought, primarily on the East Coast. We've had really 1 year of drought here in WA. That is going to restrict free cash flow in farming businesses, which means that the adoption of new technology is not going to be on the radar. Farmers will be using any spare cash they have to just run the business. They'll be risk adverse. As a requirement of that, I think we're going to have a challenge as an AgTech company moving forward in some of the adoption of our technology.
How are you then dealing with those macro factors in your decision-making process? Are you looking for different funding options or different ways to implement your project? How are they impacting your decisions?
So I'm really defining the key environments that we'll be targeting. Not every wheat growing district of Australia has had a drought, so there are opportunities in sort of more micro scale. I'm looking at opportunities globally, off to the US tomorrow to go and look for the potential. How do we spread our risk geographically, globally? We're looking at those opportunities as well. And constantly keeping in the mind of the next round of funding as well. The other one is that while farmers might not be prepared to, adopt new technology, big business needs to know it's staying ahead of the game. So how do we engage with the large agribusiness and develop those relationships as well? So ultimately when the drought breaks, and it will, and cash flow starts to come back into our farms, they'll be looking to adopt new technology. And the big businesses are going to want to be here presenting something that they can offer.
It's about weathering that storm, weathering the drought.
Yes, that's what it is. Our revenues were hit massively this year, but that's the business that we're in. And we're lucky enough to have investors that understand this is agriculture and droughts happen. But one season's you can get away with. It can't be part of the long-term global business plan. And that's why we're looking to diversify.
Have you seen your technology being applied in adjacent markets, say with wine or inputs for other adjacent adjacent markets?
We haven't really looked at that at this stage. Our background is in agriculture, broadacre agriculture. It's a big market that we understand. Maybe down the track we might look to diversify into those smaller, more niche markets that we see. They may be potentially more profitable, so we'll never rule them out. But at this stage, broadacre agriculture is what we know and what we love.
Fantastic. Darren, I have one last question for you today. I would love to hear who you'd like to hear on the show.
I would like to hear Tom Bilyeu. So for those who don't know, Tom actually started Quest Nutrition. He now has a YouTube channel called Impact Theory. So while this business is in the world of, I guess, the food and the supply chain, Tom did a lot in Quest Nutrition, developing a protein bar. But the way he talks about it, the way he communicates it, and I think a lot of the ideas that he is now portraying in his new show, Impact Theory, is about ultimate mindset and people being the best they can. So it'll be a really good opportunity that you could tie the food and the nutrition component into the mindset and making sure people are being the best they can. That'll be the ultimate.
Thank you very much, Darren. It's been a pleasure to have you on the program, and I'm excited to see how Laconik develops.
Appreciate that, James. Thank you very much.
This program is hosted by James Henderson, with technical production by Jake Olver. Voiceovers were by Angus Brennan and Shim Phelan. Thanks to our distribution team, led by Stephanie Holland, and a special thanks to you for tuning in every week. This program was produced by H Media. We'll see you soon.